Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome to my first hosting of pandemic style webinar. Thanks for coming. Sorry, I can't feed you like we normally would on our breakfast session, but hopefully we will get back to that soon. All right, and a minor panic there. My computer fell asleep, but here we are, ready to go. All right, yeah, thanks so much for coming. Today we're going to talk about updates to environmental permitting in the City of Surrey. An exciting topic. I see lots of my clients are here. Ron and Stacy, thank you for coming. We have some representatives from City of Surrey. And before we start, I'll just go over some tips and tools. We've got some new features, which I'm pretty excited about to use in the webinar. You may be familiar with it if you've used Zoom before. If you haven't, now is the chance to familiarize yourself with it. I'm going to try and make this presentation interactive. The more questions and sort of virtual discussion or conversations we can have, the better. So the two main tools that I want you to be familiar with is the chat function, which you can use at any time, especially if you're having audio problems, if you can't hear me or see properly. Enter something in the chat, and we have a crew of people in the background who can help you out. You can raise your hand if you really need to say something, or we're also going to be making use of the Q&A for questions. So if you have like technical or process questions that you want to ask, instead of using the chat, it's better to use the Q&A. So if you see on the bottom of the screen, there's chat, raise hand, Q&A. For me, it's on the top of my screen. If I bump the top, then the bar kind of comes down, and I can control that. So have a look on where those are on your screen. We're gonna test them out shortly in a couple slides. So I'm just gonna check how many people are here. We've got 30 on the line, which looks pretty good. So I think we can get started. It's 11:04. Let's get going. All right. So just really quickly, I'm coming from the environmental science group, environmental permitting, but just so you know, Pinchin as a whole does a whole bunch of other things. We've got offices all across Canada. So for example, hazardous building materials, if you have buildings that might have asbestos and lead paint, we assess it. We can even help you abate it and demo it. We don't do the abatement demo ourselves, but we have a construction project management group that helps hire those crews and run them if that's what you need. If you have like confined spaces for some reason, we have safety consulting. What else? If you have contaminated sites or need a phase one, we're doing those all the time. We have that group as well. And if you need mechanical design for your townhomes, we have a mechanical design engineering division, or if you want to do some district energy, we have that as well, which is kind of exciting. All right, so today's presenters, you have myself, Brennan Anstey. I'm a professional engineer. I've been doing this consulting for over 15 years now. After graduating, I knew I was excited about the environment, so I hopped into environmental consulting. Everything from, I started out doing contaminated sites, and then I went and cleaned up some mines. I worked on some LNG stuff, and for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been in the Lower Mainland doing development type work. Co-hosting with me is Jeremy. Jeremy, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Brennan. My name is Jeremy Nilson. I'm a registered professional biologist. I've been in environmental consulting in the Lower Mainland for the last 10 years. My specialty is in aquatic and riparian ecosystems, and in particular, the environmental permitting requirements associated with works around those resources.
All right. And I recognize some of the names, but I wanted to, let's test out our features. Actually, wait, no, these aren't even our features. Kaylee, if you can pop up the first poll, this is just to get a sense of who is in the audience, and we all get to see the results. So if you could just move your mouse and click on, do you work as Hopefully I've got most people's backgrounds, but if not, I included other categories. So developer, regulator, planner, architect, engineer, broker, or other. All right, I'm seeing developer at 44%, regulator, don't see any, but Ron, I did see your name in there. Planner, 11%, architect, 6, engineer, 28, broker, 6, and other 6. All right, thank you for that. 2 more quick polls, these ones are even easier. Kaylee, can you bring up the next couple polls? I just wanted to get a sense of people's experience with the subject matter. So we're going to kind of gloss over the WSA, but it's we're going to talk about it. So I'm just curious, talking about the Water Sustainability Act. If you've had projects where you had to do some sort of Water Sustainability Act permitting before, yes or no, or unsure if you might have, but not really clear. Just trying to gauge people's experience. Most people, yes, 75%. Right on. Maybe I'll give it a few minutes. Kaylee, are people still feeding in, or when I can see the results, does that mean that the poll's closed?
When you can see the result, the poll is closed.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So we can move on. Last poll. Thanks everyone for participating. It might be going by too fast. I apologize if it is. I've been on some webinars where it's actually, wait, no, I digress. Okay, next poll is, I think it's, have you ever worked on an SED project before? Yes, no, or unsure. And I apologize if it's we were part of a, what was it? It was like a trivia night, and the questions would sometimes close before they even pop up on our screen. So I apologize if that's happening to you. Hopefully you can see the poll and respond to it. This is the last of the one, and then we're gonna jump right into the material. All right, 16 responses, not bad. 50-50, yes, no, and a couple of people unsure if they've been on an SED project before. Awesome. Okay, thank you for that. All right, let's jump right in there. So we're gonna start with an overview of kind of the environmental landscape and talk about both the features that would trigger us to do environmental work, the different regulations that are involved apart from the SCDP process, and then we're going to dive into talking about the SCDP process, the specific changes, and kind of talk about what they mean, which is really kind of the crux of it. But we're going to kind of set the landscape for those a little bit unfamiliar, also like a refresher if you are familiar. So some of the key environmental features that that trigger this stuff, the main ones being streams, ditches, wetlands, even if normally dry. So a lot of the time we get calls from clients who say, hey, we've got a property, don't worry, there's nothing on it. Or like, yeah, there's a ditch, but it barely ever has water in it, don't worry. Normally from the regulations, that doesn't matter. Well, it might matter, but it's still regulated. So so it's important to get them assessed by QEP. There could be water features nearby, and maybe there's a setback on your property, even though there's no water feature, and green infrastructure networks in or near if you're in Surrey. Wildlife, there's birds and nesting activity surveys, but also the SCDP covers wildlife, particularly species at risk. And just a quick note, we're not going to dive into this too much because it's not a change to the SCDP per se, but there has been a change to the breeding bird survey terms of reference in the City of Surrey that came about earlier this year, which essentially makes it harder to clear trees and shrubs or your site during the breeding breed season. The breeding bird season, which is typically around, say, like March 15th to August 15th-ish. So you could still have other birds that are breeding earlier than that, like eagles and owls and some of the raptors. But generally, that's the bird nesting window. And if you are planning to clear during that time, which is not we'd recommend avoiding clearing that usually. But if you really have to, and you need a permit from City of Surrey now. So you have to do your bird breeding survey under the guidelines that Surrey recommends, and then get a permit before you're allowed to clear. So it's a lot more complicated than it used to be. We haven't gone through that process yet, but we have read the terms of reference. So something to look out for. And weeds, controlled plants. So there are now more requirements in the SED process that did not used to be there for controlled plants. So typically you have your knotweed and giant hogweed, but there's also other regionally and provincially noxious weeds such as like lanium, or it's also called, I think, yellow archangel is included in there, like Canadian thistle. So some things that you normally wouldn't be concerned about also needs to be addressed. Not a big deal, but something to consider. That's it. So those are the features that you're looking out for, and those are all covered on, well, the main regulations. There are some other regulations that I include here, but the main regulations associated with the SCDP are here. So municipally, you have your sensitive ecosystem development permit, which is a very general process. It covers water, wildlife, weeds. It even has some contaminated site questions in there. And at the provincial level, you have your Water Sustainability Act, or often termed WSA, and the main mechanisms in there usually have either an approval, which takes a long time, or notification, which is much quicker, depending on what you're doing. There's a stream determination process. If you have, say, a ditch that you think is not a stream under the WSA, the province has a process for them pseudo-confirming that yes, indeed, it's not a stream, and it would be okay to infill with some caveats. And there's also the province has the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation, which has a better acronym. The wrapper used to be called the RAR, protecting streamside areas that drain to fish habitat, and the federal fisheries. And at the federal level, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, formerly DFO, as much as the new acronym should be FOC, it's been DFO for so long, and DFO just has a better ring to it. So we're trying not to update that acronym because we don't want to until we have to. So maybe actually just a quick note. I've gone through this stuff really fast. We're not going to go into that in depth in this presentation. If you want more information on this, throw a line into the question and answer. We get a report on the question and answers later, and we can follow up with you and give you a link. We're doing a presentation next Wednesday at 11 o'clock, so a week from today, covering kind of like overall environmental processes, and it could be in any city, not just City of Surrey. So we're going to go through all this stuff in detail a week from now. If you're interested, throw us a line in the questions. All right, now we're getting into SCDP. So we're going to start at a high level, and then we're going to drill down into the changes. So why is there an SCD process? And so as I'm talking about SCDP, Ron or Stacy, if I'm saying something that doesn't quite sound right, or you want to weigh in, please weigh in on the chat feature. I would appreciate it. I have no problems if you're like, hey, Brennan, you're wrong. It's actually like this. I want that and would encourage it. So please chat away. I'm going to present my interpretation of it, fully knowing that I haven't been through the new process yet, so I haven't seen it work. I'm going off reading the material and sort of based on having been through the process, and now I see a change. Here's what I'm presuming I might expect, but I'm very excited that you're here, and I would love to hear your comments. So my interpretation is we have an SED process to ensure the municipalities are responsible to ensure compliance with provincial and federal environmental regulations during development. So that's a responsibility by Surrey, and further, the city has some environmental goals. They want to make sure that they have a healthy ecology in the municipality. So hence the whole GIN network and GIN corridor, that's kind of one of their strategies. and the SCDP works in concert with that to help create that as the city develops. And when? So when do you have to go through the SCDP process? If the site has streamside protection areas or green infrastructure network, SPAs or GINs on the site. So that's according to the flowchart companion document. However, in the terms of reference, it also says if it has SPAs or GIN within 50 meters of your site, then you may need to go, or then you would need to go through the SEDP process. So my interpretation of that, which is just sort of reading in between the lines, and please chime in on the chat if you know different, is that if you're within 50 meters, you probably need to look into that because some of the mapping is incorrect. So say you say, oh, well, it's 50 meters on the map. I suspect that the planners probably want you to ground truth that to make sure, yes, indeed, it is quite far away from your site. Nothing in your development could impact that. And after it's been, fully investigated by a QEP, then if it's not on your site, if it doesn't affect your site at all, that requirement could be relaxed. But that's I'm throwing my interpretation on there. I'm just going to open up the chat on my end so I can monitor. All right. Okay, so that is when you have to do an SCDP. Let's move on to how the SCDP process works. So this is the SCDP process from my angle, from the QEP's angle, how things normally go. So the SCDP is Surrey's way to ensure compliance. We already talked about that. Normally, how we do this is we'll go out and assess a site. We'll do an environmental review. A quick note that us doing an environmental assessment is different than us doing a sensitive ecosystem development permit application. The two are not the same, but they are related. Like an environmental assessment provides like essentially the foundation to answer the questions for the SEDP application. So we usually start with environmental assessment, then we identify the environmental permits required depending on what you want to do for your site. So we'll say, okay, here's all your features. Oh, and I see Ron has answered in the chat. Jurors review, some discretion. Perfect, thank you. So we depending on what you want to do, you say, okay, well, I want, townhouses everywhere. And I say, okay, well, you have some streams. If you want to infill those streams, you have to do, WSA, there's compensation, and you have to find a place for that compensation. So you have to balance that with, okay, well, maybe you want to develop around those streams instead, leave a buffer, and then you don't have to do compensation and you don't have to do the permitting, and it may be more advantageous for you from a development perspective to do that. Oh, sorry, wrong button. Okay. Then once we've identified the permits required to sort of get ready for the SCDP process, it's typically not just on the one QEP. You likely also need an arborist, possibly a landscape architect. You need geotech, and you may need a hydrology study depending on what your site is and what you're planning to do with your site. Once you have all that information and you know what you're doing with your development plan, you're ready to apply for your permits. So there's the wrapper. You might have a WSA depending on what you're doing. You might have to consult the FO, and you may have some wildlife permits or work to do to prepare you for your SCDP submission. The SCDP is essentially 75 questions. We have to answer them with detail and backup, show that yes, indeed, we understand the situation, we're on it, and all regulations will be followed and environment protected as we proceed with development. And I said 75 questions plus because it used to be 75 questions, and now we're going to jump into the changes. So the changes, from what I can see, is there's essentially two key documents. that outline the changes. There's the new QEP sign-off form, which came out kind of spring of this year. It's dated February 12th, 2021. I think we saw it maybe a month or two after that. It has an additional 44 questions, and it has new definitions, which we'll get into in a minute. So I've got a picture of the QEP sign-off form over there. That's the first page. I'm sure it's available on the City of Surrey's website. And there's also a companion document, the terms of reference for the SCDP. So that's where I got the SCDP applies within 50 meters of a generous sphere. It talks about green code being infills, requiring the City of Surrey review for them, and it describes the peer review process. All right, moving right on. So one of the major key changes in the SEDP process is sequencing. So in the pre-application stage, oh, I believe this is, Jeremy, this is your slide. Want to jump in here?
Absolutely. I was just waiting for this.
It's going too fast. I just blew right in there.
No, that's fine. So as Brennan said, one of the key changes or the implications of these key changes is in particular with regard to the sequencing of environmental permitting items. For a pre-application submission and meeting, it is now necessary to have a watercourse assessment exercise completed, including classification of all of the watercourses on or within proximity to the site. In addition, it's necessary, when applicable, to have regulatory confirmation, i.e. from the provincial government through the Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, or through Fisheries and Oceans Canada with regard to the status of watercourses as fish habitat. Similarly, it is necessary for a riparian areas protection regulation assessment report to have been submitted and reviewed by the province for the pre-application stage. Why this is so significant with regard to the sequencing, because most of those things do represent items that would have previously been completed through the SEDP process, is that there can be quite a turnaround time waiting for senior government, provincial and federal response to these submissions that we put in front of them. For instance, a riparian areas protection regulation assessment is typically requiring 6 to 8 weeks for the province to review at this point. Similarly, a stream determination report, say if we had a roadside ditch that was extremely marginal and we had assessed it as not fulfilling the definition of a stream under the Water Sustainability Act, that's also typically requiring about a 2-month turnaround time once submitted to the province. So needing to have these documents completed in advance of pre-application moves a significant amount of the work earlier on in the overall project timeline. In addition, there are some specific submission requirements that go with that. An RAPR submission does need to be associated with a development plan. Now, that plan can be rezoning and subdivision, or a preliminary, lot layout, or a block for a townhouse development, for instance. But there needs to be some thought given to the development plan for the site. They don't typically accept assessment reports that are, for instance, transactional, that are just for the sale of the property. That's not considered a development activity. So as such, there's not only a requirement for a great deal of environmental work in advance in support of just the pre-application process, but there needs to be some consideration on the development and engineering, geotechnical, civil, et cetera, side as well, to inform these initial submissions to senior agencies to have all of the information required to move forward with the pre-application process. Moving on to the application phase, it is also necessary to have not only a complete ecosystem development plan and potentially an impact mitigation plan, depending on the nature of your proposed development. It is also necessary to submit the application to have all environmental, provincial, and federal submission packages and the response from the regulatory agencies included in the application package. Similar to the pre-application package, this can often require substantial turnaround times from those senior agencies, but this time even more so. If your development plan included changes in and about a stream, say culvert crossings, bringing utility crossings in, those are subject to 45-day turnaround times for notifications for authorized changes. Not a significant problem when you look at the timeline of a project overall. But if you're looking at changes in and about a stream of a more substantial nature, stream diversion, stream infill, compensation works that are going to be tied into existing stream networks, all of which are very commonly required on sites with significant environmental components, then those application packages can have anywhere from a 12 to 24-month review and processing time once submitted to the province. And if those completed, reviewed, and approved packages are being required as part of the application phase for an SEDP, that's really lengthening the lead time on the environmental side of things. In addition, in putting forward proposed works like that, we would always advocate that the local government be consulted with in the generation of those plans. Strictly on a practical level, we know that the provincial and federal review of these application packages involves a consultation and referral process back to the local government, as well as First Nation stakeholders and others. As such, at that pre-application stage, we're going to have to be having somewhat advanced discussions of the development plan for the site, compensation works, environmental permitting requirements, so that we can be confident that in the when we are getting ready for the application phase, that the provincial and federal regulators, when they refer and consult back with the city, will be having an informed discussion on both parts there. The big takeaway here is that it's going to be very important to get these regulatory submissions done at an earliest stage as possible, really driven by the long turnaround times once we submit these to the various regulatory agencies. I'll turn it back over to Brennan for the next slide.
All right. So another, and I haven't seen too many questions in the poll. Feel free to fire out the questions, and then we'll have a big question and answer at the end. But feel free to start writing them now. It won't be distracting. I know sometimes it's easy to forget what the question is, so pop it in there, and we'll get to it shortly. So another key change is the stream classifications. So the stream classification definitions have changed slightly. For example, yellow coated stream, it used to say provides significant food and nutrients to downstream fish, and the word significant has been removed. So now it's just provides food and nutrients downstream, which would include just, most, if not all, streams that flow downstream. And green coated stream has a funky definition where it's not considered a stream by the WSA or fish habitat under wrapper or DFO, meaning essentially that none of the regulators consider it a stream. That's what it takes to become green, and essentially if any of those regulatory agencies considers it a stream, it gets bumped from green to yellow. So effectively, green coated stream is not a stream. And what was previously a green coated stream, like say a ditch with, like a roadside ditch with marginal habitat, that would get bumped up to a yellow. So I have lots of questions still in terms of how this plays out in the regulatory context. And my suspicion, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but my suspicion is that we sort of start conservatively at the yellow code, and then work our way through the permitting process from there. So, for example, if I have a yellow coded ditch, and I'm going through this right now with a couple clients. We have a ditch. We've gone through the WSA stream determination process to confirm that indeed it's not a stream under WSA. But the ditch, as it's part of stormwater, it does flow downstream, so it's connected to downstream fish habitat. The wrapper and DFO do apply. Even though WSA says it's not a stream, our plan is to infill it in accordance with engineering standards for the road. And so we do have to consult with DFO, and we have to confirm, like, okay, DFO, you're on board. This is what we're doing. Are you okay with this? They're okay with it. So the province is on board. DFO is on board. Technically, under City of Surrey, it would still be yellow code, even though it's okay to infill it. I'm assuming that at that stage, the yellow code gets relaxed, and the City of Surrey says, yes, okay, you have all your permits. You're following provincial and federal. It's okay to infill, but I haven't made it to that stage of the process yet. Ron, Stacey, if you want to comment on that, then I'm curious to see if you had a sort of a vision for that kind of scenario and how that would play out. So that's a big change from what it was before, and that means that when you go onto Cosmos and you see all the things that are green coded, you can imagine that you can basically know that those are now yellow to start. All right. Hopefully I'm not going too fast and this is all getting absorbed. Okay, this is the last key change that we have for the presentation. I'm sure there's other changes. These are the three that we picked out as kind of the big ones that we saw. The SCDP review process. So I remember when the SCDP process first started a long time ago. I had the pleasure of being either the first or second application, depending on how the timing works out. We were going through a peer review process at that time. So the proponent would hire their main QEP to write up the SCDP, and then they'd hire another QEP to review that QEP's SCDP and write a letter saying, yeah, everything looks okay, or okay, fix these things. And then we switched, and the city was reviewing SCDPs internally. And now we're switching to a process where there's an external review, but it's coordinated by the city's area planning division. I don't know what that means yet, but I suspect that it means that the proponent either doesn't hire an external peer review or hires an external peer review based on a list provided by the city's area planning division of approved QEPs. I'm not sure, but I'm super curious. Ron or Stacey, if you have some insight onto kind of how that plays out, I'd love your input. All right, so the process has changed. So quick overview. This is a quick overview of all the changes we just discussed and kind of like what that means for your SCDP. It means more work goes into the SCDP. We've gone from 75 to 45 questions. It means that sequencing may be challenging depending on how, I guess, planning staff is interpreting the requirements of the terms of reference, which I totally understand. For all of our regulators, they all say, you have all your other permits, right, before you come to us, with the exception of DFO. DFO is very kind. They just say, tell us what you're doing and we'll okay it or we won't. So it makes sense. And we, usually it's a juggling act where, if we can do things in parallel, we will, and we just try and be as organized as possible. And most of the time, regulators are flexible. I guess my experience is that, okay, no, I won't say that. I was going to say, when people get busy, it gets hard, right? And then if there's something to fall back on, like terms of reference or written things that say you have to do something, you haven't done it, then it can be more relied on, right? I would do the same. So more water courses are streams under the Surrey bylaw. Just are. That one's pretty clear. How that plays out for stream infill is not 100% sure. And the peer review process is more complex, largely just because there's an extra party involved, and I'm not sure how that plays out. Okay, that's a high-level overview. SCDP environmental timelines. Okay, this is participant involvement. So Kaylee, if you could bring up the next poll. I'm just curious, from people's experience, how long the SEDP has, or what your experience with the SEDP timeline has been. Just to get a sense of kind of where the SEDP normally falls. So 1 month, which would be super fast. I'll be impressed if people have gotten it figured out in 1 month. 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, or more than 3 years. That would be a long one. All right, and the results are 40% at 6 months, 20% at 1 year, and 40% at 2 years. All right. So I'm going to crystal ball how long I think the SCDP process should take based on what we know. So writing the SCDP report itself can be fairly quick if we have all the information, and that's a huge if. So maybe it takes 3 weeks to 2 months to actually write the document, prepare it for submission. But the hard part is preparing all of the supporting documents. So having the backup reports to answer the questions, essentially, that's the part that takes a long time. So we're guesstimating that, having all those backup reports and all the information required, all the engineering drawings, whatever it is, to support the SCDP, as well as the back and forth with the city to be like, hey, this is our plan. You're okay with our plan, right? That could take between 4 to 12 months. Is kind of what we have seen and what we sort of anticipate. It could take longer for a more complex project, or if it's experiencing some big curveballs. And then once submitted, maybe it's 3 to 6 months to review. We'll see how this new process plays out. So that's a bit of crystal balling, but that's kind of gives you a sense of where, I guess, I would see the timelines being for this SCDP. All right, so we're getting near the end, and then we're going to do questions and answers. So tips and tricks for successful permitting. Slide's a bit text heavy, but it's important. So essentially, do your environmental assessment early. If you already have your design plan figured out and you're like, hey, let's start the environmental assessment, we can do it. It's doable, but it may expand your permitting timeline a little bit. So the earlier, the better. I know lots of my clients have been great at inviting us early on in the stage, and I really appreciate that. It also helps to inform the development plan. If you don't know what your plan is yet, sometimes there may be environmental features that are best just to work around, and that may make more sense. Work on the longest timeline environmental permits first, which is usually the WSA approval. If you have a DFO approval, you may want to throw that one in there too. But definitely look at sort of like what's going to be your critical path. And the permits that take the longest are often the critical path. Submit any determinations that something isn't a stream early on, and that really helps avoid questions and know what permitting you may need or not need to do. We've had a few projects, recently where we did our determinations early because if the determination was actually it is a stream, then there's additional permitting on top of that that would take a long time to do. Also get all required sub-documents for the SCDP done before starting to prepare the SCDP. Because you may think, oh, we're off to the races, we're to start writing the SCDP, and then you realize, oh, actually, we need an ARVIS report and a geotech report, and then you're another couple months behind. And expect that permitting is often an iterative process. And that if development changes, it likely requires an update to your permit. Permits are very much locked in time. As we put in the application, we say, we're going to do the specific thing, and here's all our specific controls. And then the government reviews them and say, yes, for this specific thing, these specific controls make sense. But if, over time, the development plan often changes, if you don't go back and update your permit, then you may get in a jam when it comes to actually trying to do the thing, because what you actually want to do, you're not permitted for. You're permitted to do something slightly different in an old version. So it's common that we will submit permits and then have to submit updates or sometimes new applications altogether that incorporate the changes so that we can have our final version of the development plan permitted as opposed to the earlier versions. All right. So we'll skip on to questions. All right, so these are new features for me, so just hang tight while I navigate them.
We've had a pretty lively chat and Q&A. Really appreciate City of Surrey staff weighing in here. Brennan, while you sort it out on your end, I just wanted to clarify based on some feedback from the city staff there, with regard to the pre-application and application phases. It's been clarified and confirmed that at a pre-application stage, the only senior agency input that would be expected and required is confirmation of the status, the regulatory status of watercourses. And this does have a much shorter turnaround time associated with any submissions to those regulatory agencies. However, the turnaround time, the much longer turnaround times associated with actually securing environmental permits for works associated with only the application phase is still of concern there. And I saw some input from Surrey staff regarding that there is an expectation that there'd be a concurrent review by the city and senior external agencies. So is the expectation there, if you could confirm please, whether the city would start its review prior to those senior agencies issuing permitting documents, so essentially a copy of the application would be given to the city? Any clarification along those lines would be appreciated, as based on the QEP checklist that we were given in the terms of reference, it seemed quite clearly stated that approvals would be required at the application stage.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. All right, so I've got, so busy listening to your answer, I was not reading the questions. But I've got, I guess I see 4, so I'm, like I say, questions, please put in the question and answer. Nathan, I'll send you the link for the presentation, no problem. Derek's got a series of 4 questions here. So I'm gonna try it and get to the crux of the question. So Derek says, note, applications may also be subject to review and approval through provincial and regulatory permitting processes. Where external permitting through provincial and federal agencies is required, it is the city's expectation that the applicant and their QEP are complying with the most up-to-date regulatory acts, codes, practices, regulations, and standards. Submittals through other agencies must be concurrently submitted to the planning file manager and will be subject to independent peer review. And then you said, whoops, incomplete. Given this definition, can we make an application if we can't include the WSA change approval submission package? Or does it actually require feedback that comes 12 to 14 months later? This seems like a long time. Correct. So I think that's the same sort of question that Jeremy was mentioning there. And secondarily, FLNRO wants construction level design drawings included as part of a WSA change approval submission. That's an enormous amount of engineering and planning work that would be required in advance of even a formal application, which also seems very burdensome to the developer. Is it possible to get any clarification on that, or if we are misunderstanding it? Yeah, I guess that's more of a FLNRO kind of question. I've heard that before as well. I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to weigh in on that FLNRO construction level question? You might have a little bit more experience than me on that one.
Absolutely. So the standard ask from FLNRO in particular, so this is with regard to both notifications and change approvals under the Provincial Water Sustainability Act, is they ask for issued for construction drawings. And on smaller scale efforts, say a storm sewer outfall or a culvert, that's quite doable. That's reasonably achievable. On these larger projects, particularly ones that involve stream diversions integrated into a comprehensive development of a piece of land, that can be quite challenging to have issued for construction drawings at the early stage in the process where we're encouraging people to submit these Water Sustainability Act change approval applications because of the very long turnaround time associated with that. I have had some success in the past on a case-by-case basis, providing a technical rationale for why an IFC drawing can't be completed at this stage, and essentially providing a commitment that while IFC drawings may provide a further level of detail as to construction methodology, that the core in-stream components will not change. But this has very much been on a case-by-case basis. The default ask from the province is either IFC or 75%, if not 90% complete drawings.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. And I'll just read Derek's last comment. Commenting on Stacey's comment about the WSA not being issued until 75% design, curious about what the city sees as where a WSA change approval process has to be at when a project goes to third reading, since 75% is a milestone reached well after third reading, but before fourth reading. So again, like a sequencing challenge. And Derek, yeah, like it's always a balance, right? Like I know from both regulators' perspective, they don't want to have to review things over and over and over again as it goes through its design phases. But at the same time, with the multiple restrictions, yeah, it's hard to accommodate everyone and still make it to the finish line. So some flexibility is helpful, and I guess explanations too, sort of like, here's where we're at in the process, here's why we can't do more, like Jeremy was saying. But here's our promise that if anything substantial or that affects the regulation that they're concerned about changes, then there will be an update and a chance for them to weigh in, I think is particularly what they're looking for. All right. We're at 11:50. Any other questions, please type them in. See, there's a healthy chat going on. I have not had a chance to read it all. I will just pause for questions. I believe I had another slide after here. Let's see what happens. Oh, yes. So I'm curious of your feedback. What was the most important thing that you learned during the session? And please feel free to type it into the chat. Be a good reminder for everyone else. If you learned, like, had a really good key takeaway, they might be like, oh, yes, that was a good one. I need to remember that. It's also helpful for myself and Jeremy and the team to know, yeah, how useful the session was for you. while people are doing that, I will say thank you so much to everyone for attending. Special thanks to Stacy and Ron for attending and for replying in the comments. I know I've learned a lot seeing your comments, and it's been incredibly valuable. I suspect that is shared amongst the participants. So I really appreciate you spending time out of your day to come to this with us. Yeah, very grateful. Thank you everyone for coming. And with that, just a heads up that our marketing folk want your feedback on the session as a whole. So there's a lot of ways to do it. You can scan your QR code. I think a pop-up may show up on your browser when you close down this session. So don't be surprised. It's just our marketing folk looking for feedback. And we do look at the feedback, and I see it, and it just helps us make our next webinar even better. And know, yeah, what we did right, what we did wrong, so we keep improving. Okay, I'll just leave the meeting open for a little bit in case there's any last comments or questions. And if I don't see any action for the next minute, I will close down. And everybody have a lovely, warm, sunny lunch break. And thank you all so much for coming. All right, seeing nothing, I'm going to close this down.
Thank you, everybody.